They buried you thinking it was your ending, never realizing you were soil rich enough to resurrect as your own revolution. My dear chosen ones, lean in. Let the world keep guessing. Let the doubters whisper their recycled doubts. Let the silent watchers pretend they never cared. Because what they didn't know, what they weren't prepared to witness, is that you died long before they ever tried to break you. And not the type of death that ends life, but the kind that ends illusions. You didn't survive a soft awakening. You were dragged into your transformation like someone pushed off a cliff, only to discover halfway down they had wings. If they could hear your story in its rawest form, even your silence would sound like thunder. See, chosen one, while they believed you were crumbling, you were undergoing a recalibration so deep that even your subconscious had to rewrite its operating system. Nothing about your elevation was poetic in the moment. It was demolition disguised as destiny. You didn't meditate into clarity. Clarity carved its way through you like truth, fed up with being ignored. And although the world may applaud self-improvement, they could never comprehend you didn't improve. You evolved. You were not remodeled. You were rebuilt from a blueprint that wasn't meant for average timelines or predictable paths. Let's address the unspoken question your soul has whispered at midnight. Why me? Why did I have to lose everything? Why was pain my teacher instead of peace? The answer, chosen one, is hidden in the very sequence of your downfall. You were not selected because you were weak. You were selected because you were structured for rebirth, engineered for insight, and wired for depth. Not everyone can survive the internal collapse you endured without losing themselves permanently. Most people break and become fragments. You broke and became data, rearranged, rewritten, reprogrammed. When you think back on your turning point, understand this. It wasn't just trauma, heartbreak, betrayal, or loss. It was an initiation disguised as impact. And yes, let's make it clear for those who underestimated you. They didn't just misread you, they miscalculated you. They thought hurting you would weaken you, not realizing it would activate you. They thought leaving you would silence you, not realizing solitude was your incubator. They thought you'd never recover, not realizing you had already died once, which means fear can no longer negotiate with you. They expected you to come crawling back, softer, desperate, and apologetic. Instead, you rose quieter, sharper, calmer, and impossibly unreadable. That silence they mocked. It became your strategy. That distance they questioned. It became your protection. That transformation they whispered about. It became your weapon. Before we move forward, chosen one, if this message is hitting something deep inside you, if it's reminding you of your strength, your evolution, and your hidden power, then take a second to support this mission. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay connected, because every word we create is crafted to awaken, empower, and elevate people like you. Your engagement isn't just a click. It tells us that these messages matter, that they're needed, and that we must continue pushing out content that heals, motivates, and activates. Support the movement. Your growth fuels our purpose. Chosen one, you are not mysterious. You are encrypted. You are not guarded. You are elevated. You are not cold. You are measured. When someone tries to figure you out now, they aren't reading a person. They're decoding a timeline. Your presence carries the weight of someone who saw behind the curtain and refused to return to the stage. You don't react the way you used to because your nervous system no longer celebrates chaos. You don't chase, explain, argue, or beg because your spirit already graduated from survival school. You see intentions before invitations, patterns before promises, and motives before masks. And to whoever doubted your rise, they never realized that chosen ones don't come back for validation. They come back for purpose. You were not shaped to fit in. You were designed to stand out in ways language fails to translate. Your power now is not about being undefeatable. It's about being unmanipulable. You don't threaten with aggression, you threaten with awareness. You're not intimidating because you're forceful, you're intimidating because you see. So, chosen one, hold your chin higher. Your story didn't begin with a dream, it began with a death. And the veil didn't lift because you searched for truth. It lifted because lies could no longer survive in your presence. They will never understand how you know what you know, how you sense what you sense, or how you rise without noise. That confusion is your camouflage. That transformation is your legacy. And that silent power you carry. It is the proof that some awakenings don't illuminate you, they recreate you. Before we go any deeper, chosen one, if this message is resonating like a memory rather than motivation, do not leave silently. Your presence here proves you're not just watching, you're awakening, so show it. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, "Veil lifted," if you know your transformation didn't begin with inspiration. It began with a silent, internal death. No one noticed. Your support isn't for algorithms. It keeps this powerful, rare, unapologetic content alive for those who are silently evolving just like you. Stay locked in, because what's coming next will feel less like information and more like confirmation. Number 1. The identity you buried was never truly yours. The day you stopped playing a character and started living a truth they never saw coming. They didn't break you. They broke the costume you were forced to wear, and that's why they can't recognize the upgraded version standing in front of them. My dear chosen ones, this is where your real story began. Not when you succeeded, not when you healed, not when people started respecting you, but when the identity that never belonged to you finally collapsed. The world thought your shift was a phase, a sudden attitude, or an emotional meltdown, but you and I both know the truth. You didn't evolve. You shed. You shed expectations, personas, and invisible contracts you never agreed to sign. You were not losing yourself. You were returning to yourself, and even if no one understood your silence, your withdrawal, or your behavioral shift, chosen one, that moment was the turning point the universe was waiting for. You weren't born confused, you were conditioned into confusion. Before you ever questioned who you were told who to be. You were applauded for being agreeable, encouraged to shrink so others felt taller, taught to smile even when your insides were screaming, and rewarded for prioritizing external harmony over internal truth. You learned how to be liked before you learned how to be authentic. You became skilled at emotional shape-shifting because survival required adaptation, not honesty. And the world loved that version of you, not because it was real, but because it was useful. Eventually, chosen one, something inside you reached a point where it could no longer pretend. Your inner voice, quiet for years, started whispering, then speaking, then demanding, then roaring. You didn't wake up one day and decide to change. Your inner self could no longer breathe under the weight of expectations stitched together from culture, family, society, relationships, and generational patterns. What broke wasn't your identity. What broke was the illusion that your identity was ever negotiable. It wasn't a beautiful transformation at first. It was messy, terrifying, disorienting. You didn't feel liberated. You felt lost. You didn't feel powerful. You felt broken. You didn't feel awakened. You felt like a stranger to your own reflection. But listen carefully, chosen one. Collapse is not failure. Collapse is the refusal of your spirit to continue living as a lie that was the death before your veil lifted. Your former self didn't die peacefully. It was forcefully removed because the version of you required for your purpose wasn't compatible with your programmed personality. And yes, people noticed. They whispered, questioned, and judged. What happened to you? You're not the same anymore. You've changed. They were right. You changed. Back into who you always were before the world edited you. Chosen one, you might still wonder, why did it hurt so much? Why did losing that identity feel like losing everything? Why didn't anyone warn me? Because the identity you let go of wasn't just a role, it was your survival mechanism. It protected you, helped you fit in, avoided conflict, secured relationships, and gained acceptance. Letting go of it meant letting go of borrowed safety. But no matter how strong a mask is, it eventually cracks under the weight of authenticity. The moment your false identity died, something rare happened. Your perception upgraded. Suddenly you could no longer tolerate forced relationships, draining conversations, surface-level connections, or environments that required you to abandon yourself. This wasn't attitude, it was alignment. Your senses sharpened, not because you became cold, but because you became conscious. You started hearing what wasn't said, seeing what wasn't shown, feeling what wasn't acknowledged. You stopped needing explanations. You started recognizing energy. That wasn't magic, it was memory. Your true nature was returning online. From the outside, they saw detachment. On the inside, you experienced rebirth. They thought you became difficult. You simply stopped negotiating your identity. They assumed you were isolating. You were actually recalibrating. They believed you were acting strange. You were finally acting real. Now, chosen one, your presence has weight, not because you demand attention, but because you no longer perform for it. You walk differently because you know where you've been. You speak differently because silence taught you more than words ever could. You choose differently because you've seen the price of self-abandonment. And whether people realize it or not, they feel the difference. The softness is still there, but the access is not. The compassion is still there, but the compliance is not. The love is still there, but the tolerance for anything misaligned is permanently gone. This is why the first death was not a tragedy. It was liberation disguised as loss. You are no longer the character they scripted. You are the author now, chosen one, and that's why they can't predict your next chapter. Number 2. Awakening began. When your nervous system finally snapped and rewired. When your nervous system crashed, your vision upgraded beyond their imagination. My dear chosen ones, most people will never understand this part of your journey because they only see transformation when it's beautiful, celebrated, or polished enough to applaud. They think awakening is sparked by meditation retreats, crystals, affirmations, deep breathing techniques, or a sudden craving for philosophy. But you and I know the truth is far more raw, far more violent, and far more real. Your veil didn't lift while you were in peace. It lifted while you were breaking. Your clarity didn't come from calm. It came from collapse. And your new awareness wasn't learned, it was forced into being when your inner world could no longer carry what it once tolerated. The truth is, chosen one, your awakening wasn't born from enlightenment. It was born from overload. There came a moment where life didn't just stress you, it overran your emotional and psychological capacity, like a system pushed beyond its operating limits. You hit a point where your mind, heart, and body could no longer respond the way they used to. That wasn't weakness. That was the beginning of rewiring. When your nerves couldn't process betrayal, heartbreak, disappointment, abandonment, manipulation, and emotional earthquakes anymore, something inside you shut down to rebuild. It wasn't a breakdown. It was your internal system refusing to continue in survival mode. You didn't become awakened because you wanted to. You became awakened because your inner machinery refused to keep operating under illusions, lies, false connections, and emotional hazards. When your nervous system reached its maximum threshold, it didn't destroy you. It deleted old coding and installed new perception. That moment, though it felt like despair, numbness, anxiety, emptiness, or emotional overload, was actually your reboot sequence. This is why after everything fell apart, you began noticing what you never noticed before. The slightest tone change, the smallest hesitation, the unspoken energy. the truth people thought they successfully hid, the hidden intentions behind kindness, the discomfort behind laughter, the meaning behind silence. You didn't just become perceptive, you became unable to be deceived. People called it intuition, they called it sensitivity, they called it overthinking, they called it emotional intensity. But if they lived one day through the storm that rebuilt your inner wiring, they would understand why you now see through everything like glass. When your internal system reconstructed itself, it prioritized what mattered for your evolution. Not comfort, not approval, not belonging, but truth. And the moment your internal radar activated, you stopped seeing people for their image and started seeing them for their intentions. You didn't learn energy, you began feeling it. Your mind stopped needing proof because your perception became the proof. You no longer required long explanations, second chances, or convincing words. You could now sense what others couldn't admit. That wasn't paranoia, chosen one, that was calibration. Others may wonder why you're so quiet, selective, slow to trust, or unbothered by distance. They mislabel it as trauma responses or emotional coldness, but they're wrong. It's not fear that changed you, it's awareness. When your nervous system rebuilt, it removed your ability to tolerate what drains you, destabilizes you, lies to you, or manipulates you. Your new operating system no longer rewards familiarity. It responds only to alignment. This is why chaos feels loud to you now. Why certain people exhaust you instantly. Why surface-level conversations feel pointless. Why you can sense dishonesty without evidence. Why you suddenly feel what others ignore. You are not acting different. You are processing reality differently. And yes, chosen one, this evolution intimidates people because they can't lie to someone who doesn't need proof to know the truth. They can't manipulate someone who no longer reacts emotionally. They can't hide behind words when you can read their energy faster than they can formulate their sentences. They can't gaslight someone who rebuilt their inner world from shattered clarity. Your veil didn't lift in a temple. It lifted in the battlefield of your own mind. Your vision didn't sharpen in peace. It sharpened in emotional smoke and psychological fire. Your awareness didn't come from studying. It came from surviving. So when people say you've changed, smile gently. They will never understand what it means to be reborn from internal collapse. You didn't gain superpowers. You activated original perception that was buried under conditioning. Chosen one, your nervous system didn't fail you. It saved you. It broke. So you would never again break for the same reasons. Number 3. You didn't lose people. You shed the version of yourself that needed them. You didn't lose people, you lost the version of yourself that let them stay too long. My dear chosen one, this chapter of your evolution is one of the most misunderstood, painfully transformative, and yet profoundly liberating realizations you ever had to learn the hard way. When your old identity collapsed, it didn't just strip away titles, friendships, relationships, and familiar attachments. It stripped away the self that once believed tolerating emotional damage was a form of loyalty, kindness, or maturity. Most people think you walked away from them, but the real truth is deeper, sharper, and far less convenient for them to accept. You didn't push people out. The healed and awakened version of you simply couldn't coexist with the version of them who benefited from your silence, your softness, and your self-betrayal. The death that lifted your veil didn't just expose other people. It exposed you to yourself, and that revelation alone changed the entire landscape of who was allowed near your energy. The part of you that tolerated disrespect because you wanted harmony, that overlooked red flags because you believed in potential, that stayed quiet even when your intuition screamed, that accepted crumbs and called it connection. That version didn't just fade. Chosen one, it died. You didn't outgrow people. You outgrew the emotional frequency that once allowed them access. The moment your inner world shifted, It triggered an energetic separation that logic, apologies, explanations, and nostalgia could no longer repair. And yes, there is a grief in losing people, even if they were never truly aligned with you. You weren't only mourning what you lost externally, you were silently mourning the version of yourself who never learned how to demand more, who thought survival meant staying useful, agreeable, and non-threatening. That version of you sacrificed boundaries to maintain bonds, but the awakened version refuses to sacrifice inner peace for company. And of course they noticed. Not the moment you were hurting, not when you were questioning yourself in silence, not when you were trying your best to hold on, but the moment you stopped participating in their emotional economy, the moment you stopped over-explaining, stopped defending, stopped chasing, stopped fixing, stopped tolerating, and stopped hoping they would finally treat you the way you always treated them. To them, it looked like you changed overnight, but they didn't see the silent internal war you fought for years. They didn't feel your psychological exhaustion, the emotional knots you tried to untangle, the spiritual nausea of staying in places that were draining you. They didn't hear the battle between your intuition and your loyalty. When you finally walked away, calmly, without drama, without revenge, without long explanations, they confused your peace for arrogance, your boundaries for attitude, and your clarity for coldness. What felt like betrayal to them was actually rebirth for you. Chosen one, what you must understand is that not everyone who fell off was your loss. Some were the final symptoms of your healing. People who once relied on your emotional naivety, your willingness to see the best in everyone, and your tendency to blame yourself instead of confronting discomfort, suddenly found themselves standing in front of a version they didn't recognize. They wanted to keep the access but not honor the growth. They missed the version of you who explained your value instead of embodying it. They missed the version who would rather break internally than risk someone else feeling uncomfortable. They missed your compliance, not your love, your availability, not your authenticity. And that's exactly why they can no longer reach you, not even if they use the same tactics that once worked like emotional passwords. You changed the lock, and more importantly, you became the lock. So no, chosen one, you did not lose people randomly. Your transformation filtered your entire world. The deeper you went into self-awareness, the smaller your circle became, not because you became selective out of pride, but because your new identity could not sustain relationships built on your old wounds. And the greatest twist of all is this: the people who accuse you of switching up were the very ones who depended on you staying unchanged. They needed you unhealed, unaware, and unguarded. But now, the resurrected version of you does not fear losing people. It fears losing yourself again. And that is why this chapter of your evolution is not rejection, not isolation, not loneliness. It is emotional ascension. You didn't just close doors, chosen one. You changed the entire building. Number 4. You didn't choose awareness. Life dragged you into it, kicking and bare bones. You didn't seek awakening, you survived your way into it. There's a truth most people will never understand about you, chosen one. You did not wake up because you were curious, adventurous, or spiritually enthusiastic. You woke up because life cornered you so aggressively that awakening became the only exit left. While others romanticized transformation, yours was forced, uninvited, and brutally timed. You didn't light candles, sit on a meditation cushion, or chase enlightenment through aesthetic rituals. You were pushed into awareness by the weight of experiences that cracked you open and refused to let you return to who you once were. You didn't ask for clarity. Clarity demanded space and took it. Your awakening began not with peace, but with pressure. It wasn't triggered by a quest for deeper meaning, but by an unbearable accumulation of suppressed truth. Life ripped away every distraction, every illusion, and every emotional shield you thought would protect you. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't pretty, and it wasn't inspirational at first. It was survival disguised as evolution you didn't choose to see. You could no longer pretend to be blind. And that's where the real difference lies between you and those who only claim awareness. They explored consciousness. You were dragged into it by force. Chosen one, let's be honest. Before your veil lifted, you weren't weak. You were simply conditioned to endure, to cope, to adapt, to overlook, to normalize what should have broken you long before it did. That's why life had to hit harder, strip deeper, and shock more violently. Your awakening required the kind of internal earthquake that rattled everything you believed was permanent. It demanded that every false connection, every masked intention, and every borrowed identity crumble, even if it left you standing alone and confused. And when it collapsed, it didn't just expose people, it exposed you to yourself. Pain was not your enemy. Pain was the axis point of your transformation. It struck like a hammer smashing through a locked door, forcing you into rooms you never wanted to enter, but desperately needed to see. Pain ripped away illusions that comfort tried to protect. Pain revealed disguised enemies. Pain decoded the behaviors you once excused. Pain turned silence into revelation. And while others ran from discomfort, you sat in yours long enough for its meaning to rearrange you from the inside out. And then came rejection, not as tragedy, but as cleansing. The people who were pulled away weren't stolen, they were removed. Their exit was not abandonment, it was alignment. Stability didn't vanish, outdated attachments were pruned. Trust didn't fail, it was corrected. When the structures you depended on crumbled, it wasn't because life wanted you empty, but because it wanted you unattached. No hand was left to hold, no shoulder left to lean on, no voice left to validate, because awakening required you to realize that your power was never external to begin with. Then isolation entered, not softly, but like a heavy fog that no distraction could penetrate. You didn't experience peaceful solitude, you experienced internally echoing silence, the kind that forces clarity by removing all noise. Loneliness wasn't punishment, it was removal of influence. That silence became a laboratory, a mirror, a classroom, and a battlefield. You met your unhealed wounds face to face. You met your suppressed intuition. You met your real voice, the one that had been whispering underneath fear, loyalty, and emotional survival strategies. From that silence, something remarkable happened. You became your own guide. You began to trust the patterns you noticed, the instincts you felt, the inner warnings you once ignored. You no longer needed confirmation, permission, or approval, because awareness was now installed, not borrowed. Your insight wasn't learned, it was unlocked. And that's exactly why people misunderstand your clarity today. They think it came from books, teachings, or spiritual practices. They assume you decided to awaken. They assume you wanted this. They assume it was a choice. But chosen one, awakening is not a hobby. It is not a trend. It is not a spiritual activity. Awakening is what happens when lies become too heavy, illusions become too loud, and your inner truth refuses to stay buried another moment. You didn't wake up because you were ready. You woke up because life refused to let you sleep through your purpose. You were drafted into awareness like a soldier pulled into war, not for glory, but because you carried potential too powerful to remain unconscious. You didn't choose awakening. Awakening chose you because your destiny required sight that comfort could never provide. Number 5. Something had to die, so the real you could remember its origin. The day your old self died was not a funeral, it was a delivery room you didn't know you were inside of. There comes a moment in every chosen one's journey where life stops trying to guide gently and instead tears through every layer of illusion with surgical brutality. My dear chosen one, what you survived was not the end of you, even though it felt like extinction. It was the moment life stripped away every falsehood, expectation, and borrowed belief that ever stood between you and your unfiltered self. You didn't witness death. You experienced a personal demolition designed to expose the version of you that the world was never supposed to tame. While others interpreted your breakdown as collapse, it was actually the excavation of everything buried beneath who you were told to be. You see, Chosen One, what you went through wasn't destruction. It was uncovering. A deeper, older, wiser layer of you was trying to surface, and the identity built on external approval simply couldn't survive the transition. Life didn't remove people, environments, habits, or illusions because you were unworthy. It removed them because they were barricading the emergence of your real blueprint. You weren't being punished. You were being peeled open. Every tear, every disappointment, every betrayal, every silent night where you thought you were losing yourself was actually you shedding outdated versions, like a snake forced to outgrow its old skin before suffocating inside it. That internal death wasn't poetic. It felt like grief with no obituary. It felt like searching for yourself in places where you no longer existed. It felt like mourning someone who died without a cemetery, a goodbye, or a ceremony. But Chosen One, what if I told you it only felt like the end because you had never met the version of yourself who was waiting on the other side? What if the pain you interpreted as injury was actually initiation? You weren't breaking, you were remembering. You weren't becoming someone new, you were returning to someone ancient. A level of self-awareness, intuition, and perception that was always encoded in you but covered by layers of life's noise. And that is why certain moments didn't need explanations. They felt familiar. Certain people didn't need introductions. They felt recognizable. Certain warnings didn't require evidence. They felt instinctive. You didn't learn intuition, you recollected it. You didn't train for perception, you awakened it. Chosen One, your senses didn't sharpen because you studied life. They sharpened because you remembered life. That knowing without knowing how you know is not confusion. It is recognition. It is the echo of a self that existed before conditioning, before pain, before expectations, before identity was something imposed rather than discovered. Many will look at your clarity and assume you are simply observant, cautious, guarded, or analytical. They will assume you have become more serious, more distant, more intense. What they will never grasp is that your transformation is not an attitude. It is alignment. You can read tone faster than others can process words. You can detect intention before behavior has time to reveal it. You can sense betrayal long before actions catch up. This is not paranoia. It is perception born from remembrance, not fear. Chosen One, when your old self died, it didn't leave you empty. It left you access unlocked. Your rebirth wasn't about gaining something new. It was about reclaiming what was always yours, but buried under survival, silence, pleasing, and pretending. You didn't just rise with awareness. You rose with codes, with internal archives, with ancestral intelligence of your own identity, even if you cannot logically explain it. That is why people feel something different about you but don't have vocabulary for it. They interpret your calm as coldness, your silence as ego, your distance as arrogance, and your detachment as disinterest. But in reality, you are simply operating from a vantage point they have not reached. So if you ever question why life had to shake you so violently, remember this. Nothing great is built without first removing what cannot sustain it. The life you were meant to live required a version of you who cannot be bribed by validation, distracted by illusions, or manipulated by connections. The death you witnessed inside yourself was not your downfall. It was your upgrade protocol. You were never evolving into someone better. You were returning to someone truer. Your story did not begin with awakening. It began with the moment you died without dying, and that is exactly why your veil lifted long before others even realized there was one. Number 6. True power began. When you realized there was nothing left to fear losing. The moment you realized loss no longer owns you. There comes a defining moment in every chosen one's journey when the mind, heart, and spirit reach a threshold where fear simply stops holding authority. Not because life suddenly became easier, safer, or kinder, but because the ultimate breaking point already happened. You didn't become fearless through confidence. You became fearless through devastation. You reached that place where the deepest wounds were already inflicted, the most trusted bonds already betrayed, the most cherished dreams already shattered, the most vulnerable version of yourself already broken apart. You faced an internal death that stripped you of illusions, attachments, expectations, and emotional dependencies, and once you rose from that level of emptiness, loss itself became powerless. What could the world threaten you with after you already lost what once shaped your identity? How can abandonment scare someone who rebuilt themselves after being emotionally abandoned by people they trusted? How can rejection silence someone who learned to validate themselves without applause? How can judgment paralyze someone who realized other people's opinions were never oxygen? Chosen one, the reason you became dangerous wasn't because you developed an aggressive personality, intimidating aura, or cold heart. It was because you stopped needing what once controlled you. The emotional polarity that once governed your decisions dissolved. You no longer chase attachment, reassurance, or validation because your worth is no longer determined by who stays or who leaves. Your inner world stopped collapsing every time someone changed, disappointed, or withdrew from you. When people can no longer use loss as leverage, you become untouchable in a way that even silence feels like armor. Some people become stronger by building confidence. You became stronger by surviving collapse. While others learn how to climb, you learned how to resurrect. That's why people feel something different around you now. Not the loud kind of power, but the kind of quiet that makes others rethink how they approach you. It's the calmness of someone who has seen the worst and no longer fears storms. It's the composure of someone who survived emotional warfare and now recognizes manipulation before the first strike. It's the self-respect of someone who would rather walk alone than compromise their peace again. You stopped clinging, not because you don't care, but because you finally understand care isn't proven through captivity. You stopped pleading, not because you lost empathy, but because you stopped negotiating with chaos, masquerading as connection. You stopped over-explaining, not because you became arrogant, but because you learned that people committed to misunderstanding you are not your audience. Chosen one, this transformation intimidated people far more than your pain ever did. When you were broken, people found space to influence you, shape you, guilt you, or steer you. But once you healed into clarity, your independence became louder than your silence ever was. People who once felt superior to you suddenly became uneasy because the dynamic changed, not externally, but internally. The version of you that tolerated disrespect, begged for closure, feared abandonment, or crumbled under emotional distance no longer exists. And the people who were drawn to your vulnerability are unsettled by your evolution. They don't know how to navigate the version of you who would rather say goodbye than self-betray. They don't know how to manipulate someone who is already comfortable walking away. They don't know how to guilt someone who no longer confuses loyalty with self-sacrifice. You became dangerous because you discovered that solitude is not punishment, it is clarity. You became dangerous because you learned how to rebuild yourself without needing someone to save you. You became dangerous because you no longer fear being misunderstood. You fear losing yourself again. And when self-respect becomes your foundation, every decision becomes intentional, every boundary becomes unapologetic, and every relationship becomes a choice, not a dependency. This is the silent, unspoken power of a chosen one. Once you have survived your own internal death, external losses no longer carry weight. Heartbreak doesn't define you, it reveals you. Rejection doesn't destroy you, it redirects you. Distance doesn't hurt you, it detoxes you. Silence doesn't wound you, it centers you. What once shattered you is now the very reason nothing can shatter you again. So hear this, chosen one. The reason your presence carries such intensity now is not because you are unfeeling. It's because you finally understand the priceless art of inner safety. The world cannot intimidate someone who has already walked through their own ashes and learned to breathe there. You stopped fearing what you could lose because you finally understood that anything requiring you to sacrifice yourself was never meant to stay. Number 7. Once you saw the invisible machinery of society, you couldn't unsee it. When your inner death happened, chosen one, your eyes didn't simply open. They adjusted to a new level of reality that most people never learn how to see. The moment your veil lifted, you didn't just wake up. You unplugged, and once that awareness settled into your bones, the world you once called home suddenly felt like a place you no longer recognized. You realized you were never meant to blend in, you were only trained to. And once your perception expanded, you could no longer participate in life the same way others did, because you saw not only what was happening, but what was driving it. You didn't just see people, you saw programming. You didn't just hear conversations, you heard hidden conditioning. You didn't just observe behavior, you saw the invisible scripts shaping it. This wasn't something you asked for. It was something activated in you through experience deep enough to dismantle your old lens. And when it activated, it changed everything. Suddenly, crowds felt loud even when silent. Conversations felt staged even when casual, and society felt like a maze built to keep people moving without questioning where they were going or why. You saw the illusions that most people cling to for comfort, and instead of feeling proud of your awareness, you felt isolated by it. Because once you notice the machinery behind the performance, it becomes impossible to pretend the show is still enchanting. You became someone who could no longer follow systems out of habit, agree just to keep peace, comply just to fit in, or stay quiet to be accepted. Your awareness disconnected you from the world the moment it freed you from it. You didn't stop belonging because you became rebellious. You stopped belonging because your mind evolved further than the environment around you. You saw how people trade authenticity for approval, how they value appearance over alignment, how they cling to comfort even if it slowly destroys their potential. You saw how many live as if life is happening to them instead of because of them. You recognized that what most call normal is simply collective repetition, and once that realization anchored itself, pretending became impossible. Familiar spaces began to feel foreign, familiar topics felt shallow, and familiar people felt distant because nothing aligned with the inner transformation you experienced. You started to notice the emotional and psychological traps disguised as routine. You noticed how people unknowingly become defenders of the very systems that limit them. You recognized how many are conditioned to fear standing out more than they fear staying asleep. And that realization separated you, not physically at first, but energetically. You became the one who sits in a room and silently notices what others dismiss. You became the one who senses motives before words, patterns before outcomes, and cycles before collapse. This perception didn't make you arrogant. It made you unavailable for anything that required you to shrink your awareness. People began to sense this shift even if they couldn't explain it. They didn't see your evolution, but they felt it. Your presence stopped blending with the collective frequency. Your silence carried more truth than most conversations. Your energy no longer agreed with environments that thrived on autopilot behavior. You became the kind of person who is physically present, yet mentally and spiritually operating on a completely different plane, one where clarity replaces distraction, reasoning replaces conditioning, and awareness replaces blind compliance. This separation was never about superiority. It was about alignment over attachment. You didn't isolate out of fear, you distanced out of recognition. You didn't withdraw because people were unworthy. You withdrew because the cost of lowering your perception was too high. When you saw how systems subtly guide thoughts, influence choices, and shape identities, you realized how rare true independence really is. And that realization led you to make choices that no longer matched the world you used to operate in. Your standards shifted, your priorities transformed, and your definition of meaningful connection refined itself drastically. So no, chosen one, you didn't stop belonging out of rejection. You stopped belonging because you outgrew the mental architecture of the old world. You operate now from a realm where truth is more valuable than tradition, awareness is more important than approval, and authenticity outweighs conformity. The veil didn't just lift, it relocated you. There is no returning to the person who once accepted illusions as reality. And if there's one thing you know with certainty, it's this: once you've tasted truth, ignorance is no longer an option, and pretending becomes impossible. Number 8. A part of you returned, but a higher part stayed beyond the ordinary world. A part of you returned, but another part stayed where truth has no camouflage. My dear chosen ones, there comes a moment in your awakening where the greatest shock isn't what you learned, what you survived, or what you decoded. It's the realization that you will never again fit into the version of life you once called normal. The world expected you to bounce back, reattach, re-engage, and re-enroll yourself in the same emotional classrooms you once occupied. They assumed that after your rebirth you would slide right back into the familiar rhythm of everyday life like nothing ever happened. But chosen one, what they didn't know is that your awakening didn't simply change you, it reconstructed you. A part of you stepped forward stronger, sharper, calmer, and wiser, but another part remained behind the veil, where illusions cannot breathe and truth has no filter. That part of you never came back, and it never will. This is exactly why you often feel like you are walking in two realities at the same time. Because you are. One part of you exists in the physical world, taking steps, making choices, speaking words, and living a human life. But the other part lives in a realm where intentions echo louder than conversations, where energy is more honest than behavior, and where motives are revealed before they are spoken. It isn't fantasy. It isn't imagination. It's the consequence of a spiritual and psychological rebirth so profound that your awareness expanded beyond ordinary perception. Your mind returned, but your essence matured into a level of consciousness that no longer fits inside the old frameworks you once lived within. This isn't an identity crisis, it's identity elevation. It isn't dissociation, it's discernment. It isn't emotional distance, it's energetic accuracy. Most people only see the world in 3 dimensions. You now see it in layers. You see what's said, what's implied, what's hidden, and what's vibrating underneath. Where others hear a compliment, you hear intent. Where others notice behavior, you notice patterns. Where others feel confused, you feel clarity. Your nervous system evolved into an antenna that scans energy faster than your mind can translate it into language. That is not a flaw. It is the mark of someone who died psychologically and returned with vision instead of blindness. This dual awareness is the reason you struggle to enjoy small talk, forced conversations, and surface-level socializing. It's not that you think you're better, it's that shallow dynamics now feel like eating air and calling it nourishment. Environments filled with noise, gossip, competition, pretense, or emotional chaos feel suffocating because your spirit no longer vibrates at the frequency where illusions are entertaining. You don't want attention, you want authenticity. You don't seek crowds, you seek resonance. You don't want popularity, you want truth. People who don't understand this evolution label you as distant, cold, unpredictable, antisocial, or detached. In reality, chosen one, you are present, just not in the dimension they are stuck in. You are not disinterested. You are aware. You are not emotionless. You are selective about where your emotional energy lands. You are not unavailable. You are aligned with what nourishes rather than drains. When your awareness expands, comfort becomes intentional, conversations become sacred, and connections become contracts, not accidents. And yes, it can feel lonely at times, not because you are broken or misunderstood, but because so few people have crossed the same threshold. You are not emotionally isolated. You are spiritually relocated. You no longer inhabit the world. You observe it. You no longer absorb energies unconsciously. You evaluate them. You no longer walk blindly. You navigate with instinctual intelligence. What people fail to understand is that your veil didn't lift to make you mystical. It lifted to make you accurate. Once you have seen through masks, systems, programming, manipulation, energetic hunger, emotional camouflage, and psychological games, you can never pretend you don't see them. You can never unknow what broke your illusion. And you can never return to a dimension where blindness was required for belonging. Chosen one, this is your new reality, living with 1 foot in the seen world and 1 foot in the unseen. And while many may never understand the depth of this transformation, those who carry the same silent scars will recognize you instantly, not through words but through energy. Because only those who died before they died can recognize the ones who never fully came back. You didn't fail to reintegrate. You evolved beyond retracing old steps. You are awake, aware, and impossible to mislead. Because half of your spirit now lives where truth has no shadows. Number 9, you no longer react to chaos because you transcended the frequency that feeds it. You outgrew emotional gravity, and they can't stand that you no longer orbit their chaos. My dear chosen one, this phase of your evolution wasn't just emotional growth. It was a total internal reboot that rewired your relationship with conflict, pain, attachment, and energy. There was a time when chaos felt familiar, when you responded to emotional turbulence as if it were a signal you were obligated to attend to. You were once the person who felt responsible for calming storms you didn't create, fixing situations you didn't damage, and holding emotional space for people who never learned how to hold themselves. But that version of you is gone, not temporarily, not selectively, but permanently. And that is exactly why certain people don't know how to deal with you anymore. You didn't just heal, you changed your emotional physics. You used to be pulled into every battle, every guilt cue, every silent treatment, every argument, every emotional plea, every implied obligation. Their energy once had gravity, strong enough to pull you off your path, your peace, and your clarity. But chosen one, when you experienced that inner death, when your old emotional identity collapsed, when the need to please, fix, explain, defend, prove, and rescue finally dissolved, that gravitational field snapped like old string. And suddenly, you were no longer orbiting their chaos. You were floating above it, unreachable, unreactive, uninterested. People who benefited from your instability will always fear your emotional evolution. The moment you stopped responding on command, the moment you stopped explaining yourself repeatedly, the moment you stopped being accessible to drama, the moment you stopped feeling obligated to carry emotional weight that wasn't yours, they realized something terrifying about you. The power they once had was borrowed, not earned. Their influence only worked when you didn't know how to protect your energy. Their control only worked when your identity was still tied to their acceptance. You didn't just outgrow emotional dependency, you outgrew emotional gravity itself. What used to pull you in now looks small from where you stand, and they dislike it not because you are different, but because your transformation disrupted their comfort zone. They were used to you being emotionally available, predictable, and influenceable. They didn't know that once you internally died and resurrected, you came back with a new system, one that refused to run outdated emotional software. The buttons they used to press are gone. The triggers they relied on are healed. The emotional blind spots they exploited are now illuminated. The reactive patterns you once defaulted to have been replaced with awareness, discernment, and observation. You don't panic when someone pulls away. You don't chase when someone withdraws. And you don't collapse when tension arises. Instead, you watch, not with coldness, but with consciousness. You no longer seek validation because you finally validated yourself. You no longer look for peace externally because you built it internally. And here's what chosen ones eventually learn. Not reacting is its own form of power. Silence becomes strategy. Distance becomes clarity. Detachment becomes protection. Not because you don't care, but because you finally understand the cost of emotional entanglement with people who thrive on instability. You learned that some individuals do not want resolution. They want reaction. They feed on emotional movement because stillness forces them to face themselves. In your previous identity, you might have mistaken chaos for connection, but now you see the architecture of dysfunction before it even forms. Chosen one, you didn't just rise, you became untouchable in the realm where they once controlled you. Your emotional neutrality is not numbness, but mastery. You recognize manipulation not as a threat, but as information. You no longer confuse attachment with alignment, loyalty with sacrifice, or empathy with obligation. This is the clarity that comes only after losing yourself once. You refuse to lose yourself again for anyone. People who still operate in emotional turbulence feel discomfort in your presence, because you do not respond like a participant anymore. You respond like an observer. They feel unheard, not because you cannot hear them, but because you refuse to participate in exchanges that cost your peace. They feel ignored, not because you are dismissive, but because you protect your emotional bandwidth like currency. They feel confused because their old access to you is gone, and you did not send out a memo. You simply evolved. The truth, chosen one, is that once you have survived emotional collapse, chaos loses all authority over you. Storms no longer scare those who built new identities from lightning. You don't fear the weather, you can read it. And that is when you stop being emotionally controlled and start being emotionally sovereign. This is not indifference, this is emotional ascension. And not everyone is ready to breathe at that altitude.